And that became a lot because the clipper ships became the way you got to the West Coast and the way you got to Asia. And so a lot of the clippers carried China. The China trade was major, was sailing ships. And a key point a lot of people don't know. So everybody here has probably heard of the gold rush in the 1840s, right? Well, how did people get to California? Well, you see the movies, and Hollywood shows you the wagon trains going across the country. There was some of that. About 3% of the people went that way. Okay. Why only 3%? Well, that middle part of the country was not a very friendly place to go at that time. It was dangerous. Why? Native Americans. So the safer way to go was by sea. So some people went from joined ships in Boston or New York on sailing ships, of course, went to Panama. There was no canal then. And they would take a train across Panama and get on another sailing ship and go up to California. The problem with that was Panama was filled with disease. And so you risked yellow fever and all kinds of dengue fever and all these tropical diseases in Panama. So a lot of people didn't want to go that way because a lot of people got sick and died from doing that. So the majority of people in the California gold rush went all the way around, the clipper ships, all the way around Cape Horn and all the way up, 18,000 miles or so. And a lot of people went that way, and California became a state in 1850, long before the center part of the United States was even really understood or known. It was territories. I mean, the Dakotas, North and South Dakota, didn't become states until 1917, 1918.
How long might that journey take if you took the whole route, the 18?
Very good question. So people liked the clipper ships because they were fast. And so the record was, maybe, I forget the record was, might have been Flying Cloud, 89 days. But most of the time, and it all depended on wind, really, but sometimes it was 4 or 5 months.
Decent, though.
But it was a long time. But the clipper ships were fast. I love the stories of when steamships came in, even at the turn of the 20th century, there were still sailing ships. There were sailing ships delivering cargo into the 1930s. And the German submarines sank the last of them. But in the beginning, the clipper ships would race steamships. And usually, if there was a good wind, the clipper would win because they were fast. I mean, the record, I think one of the records was in the entire voyage, that all the way around, they averaged something like 14 or 15 knots, which is fast for a sailing ship. And there were days where they were making 20 knots, which is pretty amazing.
California became a state in 1850. That's where you were when I interrupted you.
Yes, California became a state in 1850. The center part of the U.S. not even really. And that's all because of the merchant marine, because these are all merchant ships. Okay, so then what happened? Well, steam came in. The British, the Industrial Revolution began in Britain, and so the British were developing steamships. Americans didn't do that initially, and then as some Americans wanted to do it, politics got into the mix, imagine that. And because the wooden shipbuilders in Maine and places like that didn't want to be challenged by iron steamships, so they kept building commercial sailing ships. And so by the Civil War, things are really going down. And then in the Civil War, a lot of companies that owned ships, including steamships, reflagged their ships. They were worried that the Confederate Confederacy would attack the merchant, their ships, their merchant ships, and sink them, so they put them under other flags. Then, so the U.S. flag merchant marine got really small, and then at the end of the Civil War, when companies wanted to reflag their ships back to the United States, Congress said, no, you transferred your flag, that wasn't patriotic, you can't transfer it back, which was dumb. And so companies lost interest in the U.S. flag. Most of the companies went out of business. So we get ourselves into World War I. There's almost no American ships. And so we had to start building ships. And so what they did is the Congress passed the Emergency Fleet Corporation Act, and then we started building all of these very slow, they're called Hog Islanders, built in mostly in Hog Island in Pennsylvania. These were very slow ships, and most of them weren't finished till after the end of the war. And then most of them were sold off to foreign interests, and so by the 1930s we had nothing. Really poorly, and I'll move it. So Thomas Jefferson even recognized, and he was a farmer and inland guy, but he recognized when he was president how important the merchant marine is, and he took steps to support it. And then Woodrow Wilson makes some comments, because he's saying by World War I, as I explained, the merchant marine is in terrible shape, going. So what happened was, through the 20s into the 30s, virtually no American ships, and of course, Franklin Roosevelt realized that war was going to come to the United States. There was no getting out of it. We were going to be in it. And he cleverly rebuilt the armament industry in the United States and also shipyards. By the Merchant Marine Act of 1936, it was the most powerful Merchant Marine Act ever passed in the United States. And what he did with that act is he created shipyards which started building commercial ships. But what they had, by building all of these shipyards, what he did is he created the infrastructure to start cranking ships out if and when the war comes, both Navy and commercial ships, both. And so without that act, we would have been in deep trouble, because in World War II, we built 5,000 commercial ships. And in the beginning, it was the Liberty ships. In the 30s, it was more commercial ships that were fast and good. The Liberty ship came along, and that was just something that was thrown out. I mean, the record for, I'm not sure I would have won a sail on one of these ships, but the record for building a Liberty ship from the moment the keel was laid till the minute it was steaming out was 13 days. So that's pretty, and all the shipyards were competing with each other to who could build it fastest. And it was Kaiser. It was Kaiser who owned a lot of yards, and he's the one that created the Liberties really quickly. And as in a little side note, Kaiser believed that his employees should have health insurance, and nobody did health insurance in those days. So the Kaiser shipyards are long gone, but Kaiser Permanente is alive and well. And that's health insurance that was started by Kaiser building the Liberty ships for World War II. Who knew?
What was William Francis Gibbs' role in the Liberty ships?
In the Liberties, I don't think William Francis Gibbs did much with the Liberties. That said, William Francis Gibbs was an incredible naval architect, and through the 30s, so William Francis Gibbs and his brother were not trained in naval architecture, but he was fascinated with it. And he designed, I think in terms of naval architecture, he was the prime naval architect for Navy warships and for commercial ships, but I don't think he had that much to do with the Liberties, I don't think. I'm not aware of that, but he was certainly doing a lot in World War II. And then, of course, his baby was the passenger ship United States. That was his crown jewel. So the World War I comes, World War II comes, and we are cranking out these ships. As an aside, by the way, and I'll cover this probably again when we get, because it bothers me in some ways. So merchant mariners in World War II, again, something that's not understood. There were more merchant mariners who died in World War II at sea, percentage-wise of the number of people in the merchant service at that time, than any of the armed services in the United States. You had a 1 in 20 chance of dying in World War II if you were serving on a commercial merchant ship. The next service with the next highest service was Marine Corps, 1 in 26, and then it went into the Army and others that was way down a lot, much less of a chance of dying. So merchant mariners were very heroic to serve on commercial ships. The problem is that they never got any veterans benefits. They never got anything. And matter of fact, they had no benefits. So if because it was the companies that were operating these ships on charter to the government that was carrying the war supplies. And if you were if you were a merchant mariner on a merchant ship and your ship went down, your pay stopped at that moment. So you weren't even paid. No medical benefits, nothing. And no veterans benefits. And that lasted. I have an uncle who I was very close to. It's the reason I went to sea. He was a commercial sea captain. And he, during World War II, he served on a tanker carrying jet fuel, aviation gas actually, in the North Atlantic. Imagine getting hit by a torpedo in a tanker carrying aviation gas, right? And then he also served in the South Pacific. And then later, he served on commercial ships in Korea and in Vietnam. No veterans benefits. And yet the guy driving the general's Jeep in Washington, full benefits. And that's true today. We have merchant mariners now. The Navy has something called Military Sea Lift Command, which are ships that follow they supply the Navy, but primarily their job is to supply task forces. So they go out, they bring fuel to a carrier, they bring supplies to a carrier and to destroyers, they refuel destroyers, all that kind of stuff. Well, those ships, you can't have Navy ships without the resupply ships. All of the mariners on those ships are civilian merchant mariners. None of them get veterans benefits, and yet they are in all the combat zones the Navy is in. Go figure. I mean, it's a sore point with me. I mean, I was in Iraq rebuilding the transportation system. Because I'm a Maritime Service Admiral, no veterans benefits. So it's a sore point for me because it's wrong. And a lot of Americans, when you hear the word veteran, and my attitude is if you've been a veteran and you've been in combat, give them the world. But today, only about 15 or 20% of people in the military ever serve in combat, and most don't even go overseas. So, go figure. Anyway, that's an editorial. Okay, so we get to the end of World War II, and 70% of the ships, commercial merchant ships in the world, are owned by the United States, are United States companies. But what does the government do? They say, well, we need to let our allies make money to make dollars so they can buy our goods because we're a big manufacturing company. How are they going to earn dollars? Well, you know what? We'll give them cheap, give them all these ships, and they can start charging for carrying goods around the world and get paid in dollars, and then they can buy our stuff. So we sold off most of those 5,000 ships to foreigners. And so our merchant marine began to shrink again, and then of course Korea happened, more ships needed, and they broke out some ships from the reserve fleet, and then it goes down again. We get through the 60s, and it starts to go down again. Vietnam happens, it goes back up. They're bringing out World War II reserve ships that are in the reserve fleet. And then we get into, then that goes down again. And when I started going to sea in the 70s, we had about 900 or 1,000 ships. But we'll see how many we have now in international trade as we move along here. Okay, so first, let's talk about what this industry is that people don't seem to understand. What is it? Well, it's deep sea commercial ships. So here's how I describe it to people that don't understand. Americans, for some reason, understand the airline industry. And when I tell people that I was in the Merchant Marine, they'll say like, oh, well, when are you getting out? Or, you know, they think you're in the military. The Merchant Marine is not military. It's important for the military because it carries military stuff. The military can't move itself. It can't move without commercial stuff. So the airline industry, if we move troops overseas, they don't go on a military aircraft, they go on civilian aircraft. If they move their stuff, tanks and food and all the stuff they need, it goes on commercial ships. They're chartered commercial ships. That's what the Merchant Marine does for the military. But it's civilian mariners and corporate companies that do this. So the airline industry, people understand. So are pilots and flight attendants in the military? No. A lot of them belong to unions. Some companies around the world are non-unionized. The aircraft are all owned by private companies overseas. A lot of them are owned by government corporations. The nature of the industry is such that it is regulated, the airline industry. So who regulates the airline industry? The Federal Aviation Administration. So it inspects the aircraft, it licenses pilots, it joins the National Transportation Safety Board by investigating accidents, as we're seeing right now with what happened last week. The commercial merchant marine is exactly the same thing. Ships are owned by corporations. The crews are civilian. They are licensed and certified by in this country, by the U.S. Coast Guard. Most countries, it's by a maritime administration. We have a maritime administration, but because of politics, that job in World War II was given to the Coast Guard and they won't give it back. I mean, the Coast Guard, in my opinion, shouldn't really be doing this. The Coast Guard has a lot of important jobs like search and rescue and security and all these other things that are really important. But they still have a division that does licensing, marine inspection, and accident investigation with NTSB. So my license is a Coast Guard license, even though I have nothing to do with the Coast Guard. It's politics. So that's how the industry is. It's cruise ships, which most people understand and realize that's merchant marine. It's all the inland stuff you've ever seen, the ferries, the tugs, the dinner boats. It's ports and terminals. Can't get anything in out of the country without a port. Then there's the business side, charterers, brokers, marine insurance, and of course you have to have lawyers, so it's maritime lawyers too. Shipyards, marine manufacturing, the whole offshore energy industry. That's all the merchant marine, that's all the maritime industry. So, and the wind farms that are offshore, they are built and supplied by commercial ships, right? That's the maritime industry. So it's a massive industry. So again, I'm not sure why, but people don't get it. So how big is it? Well, there are today 109,000 deep sea commercial vessels. And when I say 109,000, I'm not talking about all the dinner boats and tugs and coastal vessels and all the inland stuff like we have in the inland rivers, the western rivers down the Mississippi. I'm not including any of that. I'm talking about deep sea commercial ships. There's 109,000 of these things around the world in international trade. By the way, of that 109,000, how many are American today? 80. 80.
Wow.
And we'll look at that later on, which is a big concern that I have. So as I said, hundreds of thousands of inland and coastal vessels, 2 million mariners around the world. These are all people that are licensed and certified by their host governments, wherever that may be. This is where it affects everybody. 90% of everything traded in the world moves by sea on a commercial ship. 90%. That's a lot. For some reason, people in this country think everything's flown on an airplane. It's not. It comes by a ship. When you buy bananas in the grocery store, they've come from Central America, they've been on a commercial ship. When you buy shrimp, a lot of the, and you look at the package and it says product of Indonesia or something like that, it's been on a ship. That's how stuff moves, and we'll see why. So, companies are publicly held, as I mentioned. There are government-owned companies, not in the United States, but around the world there are some. So why do we do this? Well, it's all about money. But let's look at how the industry has grown, and this is why this has made literally the global economy possible. So look at 1914, 48 million gross registered tons of shipping. Now that gross registered ton term is confusing because it sounds like a weight term. It's not. Don't ask me why. It goes back to British stuff a long time ago. It's a volume measurement. It's actually on a ship, it's the internal volume of the ship minus exempted spaces like the passenger spaces, the crew spaces, the engine room, store spaces, things like that. It's not part of the gross registered ton. So if you look at gross registered tonnage in 1914, there's 48 million gross registered tons of shipping all over the world. By 39, it's 80 million gross registered ton because the global economy is increasing. Even in the middle of the Depression, it's increasing. 2024, 2.1 billion gross registered tons in 109,000 deep sea ships. That is what's made the global economy possible. Plain and simple.
Dare I ask who's building?
We'll get to that. Dare you ask is right. That's very important. Not us.
So we go from 14 to 39, 48 million to 80 million, but the number of vessels has...
Oh, good, thank you. Why is the number of vessels going down?
Yeah, that's nice.
Why is that? Thank you for pointing. How come?
Different types, different larger, whatever, I mean...
You just said it.
Yeah.
Larger ships, right?
Yeah.
And that 109,000 now are much larger ships. If it was the same size ships as 39,
Right, it's obviously...
it would be like 300,000 or 400,000
Exactly.
ships. But the ships are huge now. Okay.
Yeah.
These are the biggest container ship companies in the world, and most stuff that you buy, certainly everything you buy in Costco and Target and Walmart and all those places, if it's made somewhere else in the world, it's been in a shipping container. That's how it gets here. These are the big boys, these 5 companies. Mediterranean shipping, and this is a concern. This is a big concern I have, because when I started going to sea back in the 70s, there was probably 200 or 300 at least shipping companies in the world. Hundreds of them around the world. And dozens of US companies. This is what it looks like now. It's consolidated. So Mediterranean Shipping Company, MSC, and you'll see their containers on the road. They're big, kind of an ugly yellow, kind of orangish yellow thing on the road, and it has MSC on the side in black letters. And you can tell it's a shipping, you can tell when you see a truck on the road if it's a shipping container, because the corners, all 8 corners, the top 4 on the top, the 4 on the bottom, have a big lug with it. You can see like 2 holes, but it's like a big lug. And if it's nice and smooth, and it's not a shipping container. If it's a deep sea shipping container, it has like these lugs in the corners. Where that is where the crane comes down, and the crane sticks into these lugs, and then it twists and it picks the container up. So you can always tell by looking at a truck if it's a shipping container. But that's how the world trades. And Mediterranean Shipping Company is owned by one family. It's 100% privately owned. They are a Swiss-Italian family. The father started the company about 50-odd years ago with 1 ship, and they have about 900 ships now. And I think he's dead now. Oh, maybe he's still alive, but he's really old. His sons run the container ship company. His daughter runs a cruise ship company. She's got 4 cruise ships, MSC Cruises, very fancy, mostly in the Mediterranean. I think they go up to North Europe once in a while. So APM used to be American President. Oh no, not APM. APM is AP Moller Maersk is Maersk and MSC flip-flop for who's bigger, but right now MSC's on top. Maersk bought the largest container ship company in the world, which was Sealand. Sealand was an American company. Sealand is this one that started containerization. How and why? Walter McLean, who was a truck driver in the 50s, said, gee, you know, maybe if I move this stuff put my truck on the ship, I don't have to worry about the longshoremen getting their claws into the stuff, and you know, I can do it faster. So he created the first container ship company, ship. He called it the Ideal X, and it was like an experiment. He brought stuff from Texas to Newark, and he said, well, this is great. And then he started buying a bunch of old World War II ships and converting them into container ships, and next thing you know, containerization took off in the 60s. Sealand became the biggest company in the world, owned ports all over the world, built container ports. The American company built container ports, designed containerization, designed the containers, did the whole thing. It's all gone, 100% gone. Now owned by APM, and the other folks bought all the ports, so we don't own anything. CMA CGM is French, partially government owned, but private. Costco is our good friends and that's not Costco you're familiar with. That's Chinese Overseas Shipping Company, and they're huge. They have over 1,000 ships. And then Hapag-Lloyd. I'll tell you what my concerns are about this when we get further. I mean, it's true in any industry. What happens when you consolidate and you continue to consolidate in an industry? What happens? You don't have competition, and you run. When you're talking about a strategic industry like shipping, it's a problem, in my opinion. Okay, so let's look at a typical container port. That what you're seeing on the left there, that ship, that is an MSC. That's a Mediterranean Shipping Company ship. That's a big one. That ship, in the next presentation I have in September, we'll look at some of these kinds of ships. That ship is carrying upwards of about 20,000 containers. They're huge. These are big ships. And you can see on the right, the containers all stacked high. By the way, containers mostly come in a 20-foot container or a 40-foot container. There are some others that are different sizes, but that's generally the major size, 20 and 40. Well, how come the whole world's carrying 20 and 40-foot containers? But I thought the whole world was metric, except the U.S. Well, it is, and stupidly we refuse to convert to that. But anyway, why does everybody do 20 and 40s? It's very simple. The U.S. invented containerization. We said, well, we do 20 and 40s, so the rest of the world does 20 and 40s. That's what they do. That is a typical tanker port. In the U.S., most of our refined petroleum products in the Northeast here used to go by sea. Hence, here in Chatham, the big accident that happened in the 50s with the, that's pretty much gone now. Most of our petrol, and when I was going to sea, I sailed on a couple of tankers, which I hated, but even then we were carrying heating oil and refined products, things like that, by ship. Most of the products, gasoline and heating oil and diesel, come on pipelines up to the Northeast. Not by ship anymore. But the rest of the world, most of it's by tankers. And then you have these tanker ports, and the the big tank, what's called a tank farm in the background. That's all the tanks. And then you have a dry bulk port. Dry bulk is what is grain or iron ore or something that's in bulk. And the Western River system, all the Western River products move on the Western Rivers down the Mississippi on these massive barges, and they end up in Louisiana, and then the stuff goes ashore into a grain port or something like that, and then it's put on a ship going wherever it's going. So you also have, like, this is a break bulk port. It's things that don't fit into a container. There's a smaller number of ships. When I started going to sea, all the ships were break bulk. We had gear on the ships. The ships were smaller. It took time. You had to pick up one pallet at a time. You didn't have containers. Much more fun. Why? Because you spent time in port. Now one of those MSC ships I showed you that's carrying 20,000 containers, it goes in, first of all, the ports aren't in cities anymore. They're outside somewhere. So if you go into New York, years ago, when I first went to sea, the ships were docking right in Brooklyn or Manhattan. Nobody goes there anymore. They go over to Elizabeth, New Jersey.
Continental terminals.
And there's nothing, you can't go ashore. I mean, where are you going to go ashore? If you want to go ashore and you're on the ship, there's no place to go in Elizabeth, New Jersey. The other problem is the ships are in and out in 4 or 5 hours. We used to spend a week, sometimes 10 days, moving a few thousand tons of cargo. Now they'll move 2,000 tons of cargo before they're even finished tying up the ship. And so the ships, even though the ships are big, they're moving very quickly and they're in and out in 4 or 5 hours. So people get on, the crews get on the ships and they don't get off until it's vacation time, which is months later. It's not as much fun as it used to be. You don't see the world on a commercial merchant ship anymore. So this is typical. That's the Mississippi River there. On the right, that's a car port where the car carriers come and discharge their cars. Basically a car carrier, very ugly looking ship. It's basically just a floating parking garage, really. The closest one here is in Quonset Point in Rhode Island. And you'll see the big car carriers come in over there, discharge cars from, some from Asia and some from Europe. And the Mississippi on the left there. The Mississippi is actually the largest port in the United States tonnage-wise, because most of there are container ports in the New Orleans, Louisiana area, but they're not that big. But the bulk ports, which carry all the agricultural stuff from the inland part of the U.S., makes tonnage-wise the Louisiana ports the biggest in the country. And there's your carport again. A few cars there.
Yeah.
And the car carriers in the background. So here's the busiest ports in the world. Now, this is a surprise to some people, because you would think that the U.S. has lots of ports. We do. Not busy like, guess who's the busiest? China. Look. So we have here, China is number 1. Shanghai is huge. Here's the United States, way down, all the way to the third from the right is the United States. All these countries have much larger ports than the United States. And China has, of these 20 ports, I think, I forget, 10 of it says 10 of the 20 busiest ports in the world are in China. No surprise, I suppose. But if you look at the United States, so Shanghai is up at 37 million containers a year they're moving. 37 million containers a year. And down here in the United States, Los Angeles is the biggest. It's actually not just Los Angeles, it's LA Long Beach. 8 million, that's our biggest one. And all the other ports are much smaller. So we're not doing much in terms of trade. That's, by the way, why Canada and Mexico are our #1 trade partners. That's where, because stuff's going that way, right? So if you look at the US, you see LA Long Beach in 2022, that's almost 10 million containers combined. New York, 4 million, but these are the big ones here. And it gets much smaller as you go down the list. Boston isn't even on the list. Boston used to be a big port, but not anymore. Longshoremen pretty much screwed that up. They got too greedy, and the contracts were too crazy, and the shipping company said, we're done. So not a lot of container ships go into Boston anymore. Now, this is how it works. This is a fancy word, intermodal transportation. Well, what is that? Well, that's how you get your stuff. Every day you go to the store, this is how it happens. It's a fancy word. All it means is intermode of transportation. In other words, different modes of transportation. So, how do you get stuff? You go into your, what's a good electronics store in Hyannis? Is there a Best Buy down there? Okay. Most of the Best Buy stuff is coming from Asia. How does it get here? Well, it's at the factory in Asia, whether it's Japan or China or Indonesia or Vietnam, one of those places. The TV is put into if it's TV, it's probably in a 40-foot container. The 40-foot container is taken on a truck. There's an MSC truck. Now that's that MSC sign right there. That's what it looks like. So when you want it, that's the Mediterranean Shipping Company. It's put in a container like that. The truck goes to the port. There's container cranes, which we just saw in the previous slide. It lifts it onto the ship like that. The ship comes across the United States. Now, until recently, all the containers were discharged in either Seattle, Oakland, or LA Long Beach. And then they're put on a train. And the train comes across the United States. And in this case, for Cape Cod, the train comes into another intermodal port in Worcester. And in Worcester, if you've ever been near Holy Cross, where you take the exit to Holy Cross and you go north a little bit, there's a whole bunch of trains around there. And if you look, you'll see some cranes. Well, those container trains go into that port. There's a crane that picks up the container, puts it on a truck, and it drives it down to the Best Buy in Hyannis. So that's how the stuff gets here. It doesn't go on an airplane, and here's why. So a flat screen TV from Japan to Boston, how much does it cost from the factory to the Best Buy? It's about $10. And because freight rates go up and down because of what's going on in the world, and all these crazy things happen, like people shooting at container ships in the Red Sea, all this stuff impacts rates. So somewhere between $10 and $25 to get that $1,000 TV to the Best Buy. It doesn't cost very much. A bottle of wine, 10 cents from France. That's all the trucking, all the railroads, that's everything. A car from Korea to Boston, $1,500, and it might be $3,000 if it's an expensive car, which is why a lot of the companies overseas build factories in the United States, because they're avoiding that charge. But they have to weigh that. How much more am I going to pay for labor and benefits in the United States vice in Korea? Which is better? So they'll make those decisions. Your bananas, you get a bunch of bananas in the store. They've been from Central America, probably 20 cents for the transportation. A washing machine from China is $20. The whole shipping charge, all the way from China. I was talking to somebody the other day. Where was it? Maine? Well, I'll tell you this. 2 examples. Fish that is caught by fishing boats off say in the Grand Banks, and is brought into New Bedford, a lot of it is not processed there. It's put in a container, a refrigerated container, taken to, I guess probably, I don't know, probably gets to Boston somehow or maybe to New York. It's put on a ship, it goes to China, they process it and they bring it back and then they sell it. And it's cheaper than to process it in New Bedford. Furniture in North Carolina, they'll cut the trees down, they'll take them to China, make the wood, make it into wood and ship it back to North Carolina, and they make the furniture there. That's because the shipping charges are so low. That's why the global economy is possible. So your crude oil from the Middle East, that transportation charge is about 25 cents for a gallon of crude oil, that's all. So you're paying almost $4 a gallon. It's only costing 20 cents, 25 cents to get it here. This is why the global economy happens. Okay, so where are all these 109,000 ships registered? They're not in the U.S. because we only got about 80 in international trade, 80. And there's a reason for that, which is not, there are no companies in the United States. All those 80 ships are owned by foreign companies, which have a U.S. company, because the law says, oh, to own a U.S. flagship, it has to be U.S., and to carry military cargo, has to be a U.S. company. So Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd and MSC, they have a shell company in the United States. Oh, we got our company here, we can carry, and they put a ship under U.S. flag, which they own, and the profits go back to them, doesn't stay in this country. Those are why we have the 80 ships. Only reason. There are no American companies left. Zero in international trade. Not one. They're all gone. And we have some companies that will go to, and I'll talk about this, the Jones Act protects U.S. port to U.S. port. So we have American companies that go to Puerto Rico and to Hawaii, things like that, because they're protected by law. But in terms of companies carrying stuff overseas, no U.S. companies, except Maersk will say, oh, but that's an American company. No, it's not. Where do your profits go? They go to Rotterdam. They don't come to the U.S. So where are these ships registered? Well, they're registered in what they call flag of convenience countries. Look at this. 55% of the world fleet is registered in these countries like Panama. Notice here, Panama has got 15.9% of the world's fleet. Liberia's got 15.2%. Then the Marshall Islands, which is a U.S., they're in free association with the U.S., the Marshall Islands, which means they're independent, but we control their international affairs. And then you go down to the rest. Well, now why did somebody put their ship under Panamanian or Liberian flag? Why would you do that? Because taxes, you don't pay tax. You give the country a fee, which is like dirt cheap. They'll take it. You know, anything's better than nothing. So yeah, you can keep your ship under my flag. Never goes there. Even though Panama has the biggest fleet and Liberia number 2, none of those ships are going to those places. They're just registered there. And you do it because of taxes and because of crew wages, because American seafarers get paid American type wages, and if you're in a Panamanian or Liberian ship, you're getting paid very little.
What about safety regulations?
We'll get to that. It's a very good question. Okay, here's one of the problems we'll get to when we talk about piracy. This industry is so international in scope that ships are designed in one country, they're financed in another country, they're built in another country, they're owned by a shell company in another country, true ownership by a person or company somewhere else, flagged in another country, operated by a company in another country, and the crew is from a manning agency in yet another country. Those container ship companies I showed you, those are easier to understand. They don't do some of this stuff. But if you want to be unscrupulous, You can in the shipping industry, and you can get away with it. Case in point. So I was at the Maritime Administration. One of my offices was the Office of Security. This is back in around 2010, 11. And we heard, this was piracy off Somalia, it was big. So we heard a ship had just gotten taken. We knew the name of the ship, and it was registered in Antigua and Barbuda, which is one of those flag of convenience countries. Well, the ship was registered there. It had never been there, but it was owned by supposedly a company in Europe, but we weren't sure where. So I found the company, theoretically, in, I think it was Italy. So we called, and we actually got the guy. He's probably running out the door to the pub, but we got him before the end of the day, and we said, the ship has been taken by pirates. Oh, I didn't know. He was the security guy. He didn't know yet. So he said, well, we're trying to track this down and find out more about how this has happened, and could you tell us the company that, who can we talk to that really owns the ship? He goes, well, you know how these things are. The answer is we couldn't find out who owned it. And that's how people can get away with stuff. Again, that's not the problem with the big container ship companies. They're much more transparent, but it is with all the other ships that you can't figure out what's going on. And so you look at where does a cruise come from around the world. Notice the Far East is number one. The number one country that produces seafarers is the Philippines.
Does each ship have to be insured?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't think people would carry cargo, put a cargo unless they thought you had insurance. But again, you can be sure that the companies like Maersk and MSC, all those, that's all above board. That's all insured, you bet. When you get into the substandard ships, which are like a bulk ship which picks up grain from one place and it's carrying it to some other place, you can get some really substandard situations there. And places where, and I'll talk about this in my next lecture, where the seafarers haven't been paid in 10 months. And their food is horrible. People have been abusing seafarers for hundreds of years, thousands of years. So in this country, where do people get their license, that Coast Guard license you have to have? Well, there's maritime academies. There's several in the U.S. Maine's got one, Massachusetts has one, New York has one, Texas has one, California's got one, the Great Lakes have one. And then there's the federal one where I went to school, the United States Merchant Marine Academy, which is like Annapolis and West Point. It's a federal academy. It's different. There are some in-house programs. There's union schools. You can, in theory, still work your way up from an ordinary seaman to captain without going to a maritime school, a maritime academy. You have to go to school at some point. But it's hard. It's very, very few people can do it anymore. But theoretically, it's possible. But seafaring's still dangerous. We'll cover this more next time. But these are both new ships. That MOL ship, that's a Japanese ship. Japan builds fabulous ships, probably the best in the world. And look at that ship. It's MOL. It tells me, I don't know exactly what happened there, but the ship is obviously loaded wrong. And it's all done by computers. I don't know how it happened, but it got into a seaway, and there was probably we got hogged, which is like that, and too much weight at both ends, it broke the back of the ship. On the right, that just happened about 2 years ago off of Libya in the Mediterranean. The ship caught fire. The crew tried to get it out, but the size of the crews, this ship is 1,000 feet long, and you've only got 19 people in the crew. You don't have enough people to fight a fire. And it got out of control. They abandoned ship, and the ship burned. The fire was so hot, it melted all the containers and the house and everything. You can see, it's unbelievable. And it created an environmental nightmare, too, at the same time. It's still dangerous, very dangerous, even now. And those two ships are safe, well-built ships. That's the best, and it still can happen. Okay, so back to the question, how about the safety on the ships, and is this regulated? The answer is it is. When I started going to sea, It wasn't. If you were on a US flagship or a European flagship or a Japanese ship, everything was above board. If you were on another ship registered in Panama or Liberia, anything goes. You could buy a license to be the captain. It was unbelievable. Well, along came the International Maritime Organization, which was created in the 70s. Now, a lot of people, for good reasons, criticize the United Nations. Lots of reasons to criticize it. But the UN actually has some organizations within it that do great stuff. One is ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, which regulates the airline industry, and one is the IMO, International Maritime Organization. And the IMO is located in London. It's on Albert Embankment, kind of catty corner from the Parliament building, right there. I was on the US delegation for several years. And it's set up like a UN, and there's actually 200 countries in the IMO, and what they do is they create safety and security guidelines for ships. And this started, and it moves really slowly. I mean, this started in the 70s, but they really didn't get their act together until the 90s. It took a long time. But the IMO moves quicker now, and after September 11, 2001, they really moved. They created security standards for the industry within like a year or two. It was lightning speed for the IMO. You don't vote at the IMO, you reach consensus. And then what happens, you come out with IMO guidelines on safety and security for a ship. And then it's up to the governments of those that, like Panama, Liberia, or anybody else that has flagged ships, to implement IMO standards. And if you don't implement them, you're going to have a hard time getting into any other country. So a ship trying to get into the United States that is not complying with IMO regulations isn't going to get in. And you're also going to have a hard time getting insurance. So the answer to the question is, it's not perfect. There's still problems, but it's cleaned up a lot. Did you have something?
No, I'm good.
How are we doing time?
We're just running out of time.
Okay. Well, we're moving we don't have too much left. So that's how the IMO works. And I will say they have done a fabulous job making the industry safer. And they try their best to take care of seafarers. They have a labor organization within the IMO that tries to look at the seafarer rights, create a minimum wage for seafarers. Most of that's coming along. Some companies still aren't abiding by it. But if you come into a country that and your ship isn't complying, you're going to be arrested and fined. And even if you go into an African country, the Africans love to arrest you because there's money in their pocket. So it does work. Okay, in this country, who regulates the industry? These are the organizations. The Coast Guard is the primary one. The Maritime Administration, which I worked for, it does manage cargo preference, but it doesn't have a lot of managing of the ship itself. The Federal Maritime Commission does keep an eye on freight rates. If you go crazy on freight rates, they will step in and say, wait a minute, what are you doing? Or there's too much consolidation, they'll step in, but they have very limited power. But those are the organizations in this country that sort of do it. I alluded to these laws that support the maritime industry. The Jones Act basically says if you're shipping from an American port to an American port, it has to be an American-owned ship, American crew. That's why everything going to Puerto Rico and Hawaii or Alaska is American, and that's why we have some ships. And people criticize the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation, which are conservative organizations. They think the Jones Act is an anathema, and they've tried to get rid of it. I've written extensively. If you want to read more, you can just Google my name and Naval War College Review. I've written many peer-reviewed articles, one of which was about the Jones Act. Actually, that's in the Journal of Maritime Law and Commerce. But the Cato Institute hated the fact that I was supporting it because it's really important to have some ships and some mariners. Otherwise, the military can't move their stuff because we got no ships, no way to get their stuff anywhere. But Cato doesn't seem to understand that. This is my concern with the consolidation in the industry, which I mentioned. When you start getting fewer and fewer ships, which is what's happening, and even these big companies like MSC, if MSC starts to lose money, remember, one family owns that. What happens when the container rates go down and they say, well, we're done, we'll just sell everything off? Who are they going to sell it to? Guess who? So here's the deal. China owns the largest fleet of merchant ships in the world. They own more ships than anybody else, by a mile. They're the largest shipbuilder in the world. 50% of all the ships built in the world are built in China. They're the largest financier of ships. 50% of all ships are financed by China. They're the largest port operator in the world. They control more ports than anyone in the world, around the world. And they have more maritime students studying the maritime industry than anybody else. Notice this next picture. This is a picture in Piraeus.
That's Greece, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the port headquarters in Piraeus. 62% of the port is owned by China. And it's happening everywhere. This is what they own. Those are their primary ports everywhere. Notice the U.S., the West Coast. Yep. They own, of the container ports in the world, over 50% of the container ports in the world are either owned outright by China or there's China interest in the control of the port. They're incredibly powerful. So we look at shipbuilding. China, look at this. $50 to $100 million to build one of these big ships. In the U.S., $200 million at least. I think that figure's conservative. I think it's more. China's cheaper. Time to construct. China 10 to 12 months. U.S. 2 to 4 years is the answer.
And this is one ship, you're saying?
One ship. Cost to build a Navy destroyer. China $888 million. U.S. $2.5 billion, and it takes 4 years. It takes China a year. So when China says, oh, well, their defense budget's only this big and ours is this big. Yeah, but they buy a hell of a lot more with that money than we do. Their defense budget's huge compared to the United States because they get more bang for the buck.
Maybe the Donald should see this. Maybe the Donald should see this.
I think he knows, some of his people know it, but if he can build a hotel there, it'll be okay. Look at their fishing fleet. 800,000 seagoing fishing vessels, 200,000, 17,000 in distant. The 800,000 are a lot of them are around the South China Sea, which is one reason they're trying to control the South China Sea. But 17,000 distant vessels, they are sucking up the fish everywhere around the world. And this is how piracy started in Somalia. Somalia has very rich fishing ground, particularly tuna. And the Somalis have no navy. Not everybody, but there were Asians and European countries sending fishing boats and sucking all their fish up, and the Somalis are defenseless. So finally they said, well, let's go out and take that fishing boat. They took the fishing boat and said, hey, that was pretty easy. What about that big thing over there? Let's try that. And that's how it started. So, this is my editorial. We are not a maritime nation. Don't let anybody tell you we are. We've got no reason to claim that. We are a maritime dependent nation, absolutely. But we don't own any of the industry anymore. It's gone. We've left it to everybody else. I think that's a big problem. So that's it. Again, if you want to read anything more, if you really want to get into some of this stuff, you can Google my name in Naval War College Review. There's a whole bunch of articles I've written when I was chair of Merchant Marine Affairs there. It's concerning. I really am afraid that China is going to continue to consolidate, continue to control the industry. And remember, that's how we get our stuff here and how we export stuff. Well, if they're controlling all the shipping, we can't import and export, and we can't support our military.
Not to mention the pricing.
Well, that's the other part.
Control over the price.
Right, that's the other problem. When you consolidate an industry, then you start to control the price. And there's nothing you can do about it. And it's an industry that takes, you can't, the old economic theory is, well, if you're taking it over and it's too expensive, there'll be a new entrant into the industry. Well, that works for some industries. It doesn't work for shipping, because to establish ships and ports and infrastructure takes years and tens of billions of dollars. You're not going to do it overnight. You're at the mercy of people taking this over, and that's where we are. So one last thing, yeah.
Does China have a percentage of the Panama Canal?
No, it's not quite true. Imagine that. But what China does control is there's a Hong Kong-based company called Hutchison Whampoa, large port operator around the world. It's China. It's a Hong Kong company. Was British, but not now, because Hong Kong is not British anymore. And Hutchison runs the ports on either side, the container ports on either side of the canal. So that is a true statement. And it is a concern. I think that's a legitimate concern. I've been talking about that for years. It's the concern that they own ports everywhere, strategic. Those are strategic ports. As far as is the U.S. getting ripped off in terms of ships going through the canal? No. I mean, we never had any agreement that our Navy would go for free. And by the way, there's some tension there now, because the president of Panama says Navy ships are free, and the Panama Canal Authority says no, they're not. So I don't know what the outcome's going to be, but we're going to own it anyway. So it doesn't really matter. So one last thing. This is homework assignment if you wish. So this is a book I have for sale here. It's $15. And I wrote this, it was published this past year. This is about a bunch of ships I sailed on. It's not every ship. The first chapter is more on the academic side. It explains much of what I talked to you tonight about. How does this industry work and what's it about? But then it gets into, then the second chapter is why I went to sea and how I went. And my first ship, I was brought to the U.S. on the passenger ship United States when I was a little boy. And that's how I got here. And so I've always been in love with the sea. So the second chapter is about that. And then the rest of the chapters are many of the ships I sailed on. Each chapter is sort of independent. I have to warn you, it's very salty. Things going to sea then are not like they are now. I mean, that IMO we talked about, by imposing all the regulations that they have now, safety and security on ships are much more controlled. The crew is much soberer now. These are pretty wild stories. So if you want to take a walk on the wild side, you can buy my book. And it will explain, and then if you come to the next lecture in September, you can ask me some questions about what's in the book. So I have a bunch of copies if you want to buy it. Okay, any last questions? Anybody on...
If anyone has a question at home, please feel free to put it in the chat, and I will editorialize groups of questions if there's more than one. But so far, all I have is excellent presentation, and thank you. It was great. So,
Well, enjoyed it thoroughly. Yeah?
But refrigeration, you said fish going across and coming back again. So is that frozen, and how do they keep it frozen?
So good question. So what container ships generally do, that 40-foot container or the 20-foot container, there's refrigerated containers. And so they have a diesel engine in them. So when they're put ashore, they turn a diesel on and it runs, it's a generator that runs it's a chill box. That's like a refrigerator.
Like a refrigerated truck, same thing.
Same thing. Mm-hmm. And then it goes on the refrigerator, and then it goes on the truck and it's delivered. When it goes onto the ship, they turn the diesel off and they plug it into ship's power.
Ship power.
Mm-hmm. And then it runs, the ship's power runs it. And so that's how it happens. So,
Admiral, I have one question. What sea state can a container ship absorb?
good question. So the answer is all ships are weather routed, which means that, in fact, this station, WCC, used to send weather reports to ships.
Great.
And so the ship would get a weather report, and there's companies that were weather routing companies that would send a message to WCC to send to ships on this particular run, avoid this storm, go south, go this way, don't go in a great circle, which is the shortest distance between 2 points, don't go from Boston to Bishop's Rock off of England on the Great Circle, go across to the Azores and then go up because you'll avoid this winter North Atlantic. Doesn't always work that way, by the way. The bottom line is, it doesn't always work that you get around the weather. Sometimes it's everywhere. So what's the answer? The question was, what sea state can a container ship take? The answer is the ships can take a lot, but as you go fast, you have to slow the ship down. So if you're familiar with being in like a Boston whaler or a small boat, what happens when you go fast and you hit the wake of another boat? You bounce like this, right? Well, a 1,000-foot ship does exactly the same thing, except it's in slower motion. And so if you're going too fast and you have a 40-foot sea running, the ship is going to go up and it's going to crash down, and the whole ship is going to shake, and you'll hear the steel bending, and you can watch it bend. You can actually watch the steel bend. So in some cases, what you do is you have to slow the ship down till you only have steerage way with enough power to be able to keep the ship on the course. But I've been at sea on a 700-foot ship, which is by no means the biggest now, in 80-foot seas where we were actually going backwards because we had slowed down, and we still have the engine propeller enough to keep the ship heading into just with the seas just off the bow. Otherwise, you've got it on the beam and probably roll over. So with slowed down enough to keep steerage way, the ship was actually going backwards. But again, to answer the question, a 1,000-foot container ship can take a 40 or 50-foot sea with no problem. When you get to 80 or 90, it gets tricky, and it depends on how well built the ship is. So I was on one ship in the North Atlantic. It's in the book, the story, where the captain was looking down the neck of a jug most of the time, and and we got into a storm. We were slowed down, but we were in the wrong part of the ocean. He refused to be weather routed. And we probably had there are freak waves, which everyone denied. Mariners are making this up. That's not true. They can't be. So if the waves are running 30 or 40 feet and then one comes in at 100 feet, everyone says, well, that's not possible. Well, actually it is. And so a satellite in space has found they're everywhere, and there's always freak waves out there. And what happens is the energy in the wave, for some reason, the energy in one wave collapses and goes into the wave behind it, and it builds that wave up. And then if another one collapses, it builds it up more. So in this particular case, we were on a ship where it's a 700-foot ship, and the seas were running 50 feet or so, and it was a change of the watch. The captain was up there. I won't repeat some of the language. You can read the book. But all of a sudden, we felt the ship go down like this, and all we could see was water. Mm-hmm. And I'm guessing it was about 100-foot sea that came over the top of the ship. We lost 300 containers. So these things do happen even now. And that's bad when you lose containers over the side, too, because other ships, people in sailboats run into shipping containers, are pretty much in bad shape.
We have a question. Are navigation aids still appropriate or out of date or underused?
I hate to answer this question. I'm an old-time sailor, and I love the lighthouses, and I love buoys, and I love the old way. And honestly, when I was second mate, my first job as second mate, I was on a ship called the Solon Termin, and it was a Likes Line ship, and it was an old freighter, the old kind. Lots of time in port. The second mate was the navigation officer, so I took that ship all around the world with my sextant and using navigation aids. The answer is, honestly, you don't need them except because the ships aren't using them, they're using GPS.
GPS.
Everything is 100% automated now. But the IMO will not, and so shipping companies will do what the IMO says, and the IMO says you still have to know how to use the sextant. Well, that's good, but if you don't use the sextant all the time, you're not going to be good at it. You might know how, but there's an art to being able to take stars and take a sunline. You just don't do it. It's not something there's a technique that takes practice. So the IMO still insists on the use of navigation aids. It still insists on using the old-fashioned navigation and the mariners to know how to do that. As long as that requirement stays, we're going to we're going to have buoys, we're going to have lighthouses, we're going to have things like that. What has mostly disappeared is things like radio direction finders. So that was the first electronic navigation system. So you'd have a radio station, or radio stations plural, and they were transmitting a radio wave, and then on the ship you had a wheel that you would turn, and you would, with your compass, you'd figure out where that's coming from, and you'd put a line down on the chart, and there's another one coming that way, and where the two cross, that's where you are, theoretically. That system's pretty much gone by the boards, and so had some other electronic systems like Loran, which was developed at the end of World War II. That was good for about 800 miles, and then Loran C came out, and that was a little bit more, but that's gone too. All those are gone because of GPS. But so a good mariner will use the art of navigation is to use all available means. And I can tell you from personal experience, for example, one of the things that I always insisted upon when I was more senior on the ship is when you are near land, you have that depth sounder turned on. And well, why do I need a depth sounder? The electronic GPS. Because if your GPS fix says you're here and the depth sounder is, and here is 300 feet, your depth sounder is showing 50 feet, there's a problem. So you should always use all available means of navigation. That's what a good navigator always does, is use all available means of navigation.
And then there are places like Chatham where keeps the harbor master busy keeping the navigational buoys where they should be all the time, because they're always moving.
They're always moving, and the Coast Guard does that too.
Well, the Coast Guard uses the auxiliary, because I was in it.
Really?
Yeah, the auxiliary actually is responsible to maintain the aids to navigation offshore.
That's great.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Christopher. I appreciate it very much.